Hello everyone, and welcome to the Puzzle Proof, your go-to corner of the internet for unraveling mysteries, brain teasers, and everything that keeps your little grey cells a-buzzing. I'm thrilled you've joined us today. Before we dive in, drop a comment below and let me know, where in the world are you tuning in from? Can't wait to see our community map grow. Chapter 1, The Death in the Library. The November rain had fallen steadily all day, drumming on the windows of Elmbree's cottages and turning the lanes into winding rivulets of brown water. To the villagers, it was merely another dreary evening in a season of dreary evenings, but to the inhabitants of Grimswell Manor it became a night forever marked by darkness deeper than weather. The manor itself was a stern and sprawling building that looked down on the village like an old tutor upon restless boys. Built in the reign of Queen Anne, it had accumulated additions like a man acquires eccentric habits, a wing of narrow passages, a tower that served no purpose, and a library so heavily panelled that its atmosphere seemed perpetually dusk. Sir Alistair Grimswell was its master, and though he was known for his scholarship, he was not much beloved. He had written a book once, long and difficult, on the futility of belief. Its arguments, said the vicar, were as cold as a stone wall and as hard to climb. Yet the villagers respected him in the way they respected a thunderstorm, not with affection, but with wary acknowledgement of power. On that wet evening, Sir Alistair had withdrawn after dinner to his library, as was his nightly habit. He was seen by the butler, who placed a decanter of brandy at his elbow and withdrew. The clock in the hall had barely struck 9 when the peace was torn apart by the sharp crack of a pistol. Servants rushed to the door, finding it locked fast from within. They hammered with fists, then with a poker, until the heavy bolt splintered under their assault. The sight that met them was both simple and dreadful. Sir Alistair slumped in his chair, a dark stain spreading across his waistcoat, and at his feet a revolver, still warm. The physician, summoned from the village, shook his head gravely. "It is plain enough," he said. "The man has taken his own life." And indeed the position of the body, the solitary weapon, the bolted door, all pointed to that conclusion. The servants crossed themselves, except for the butler, who merely tightened his lips. The housekeeper whispered that it was a curse. The maid burst into tears. Yet for all the obviousness of the scene, something about it felt wrong. The library was a chamber of ordered thought, yet its books lay strewn across the floor as if swept by a sudden arm. A Bible lay open on the great desk, a strange intruder among volumes of Voltaire and Lucretius, its gilt edges dulled by a faint smudge of ash. And on the wall above the hearth, a portrait of Sir Alistair's ancestors seemed to frown with an old, aristocratic disapproval, as though they too doubted the verdict. When Lady Miriam was told, she neither screamed nor swooned, as some might have expected. She stood perfectly still in the doorway, her hands clasped so tightly on her rosary that her knuckles whitened. Only her eyes betrayed her grief, wide, dry, and burning with a pain too deep for tears. The inspector from the county town arrived before midnight, his cloak soaked through. He examined the room with the cautious air of a man checking accounts. "Suicide, beyond question," he concluded briskly. "The bolt proves it. We shall record it so." But the declaration satisfied no one. The servants muttered of strange sounds and moving shadows. Some recalled Sir Alistair's defiance of religion, others his sudden dark moods. Rumour sprouted like mould in damp air, that the manor was haunted, that the devil had taken his due, that Sir Alistair had been found disputing with spirits. Among the company that gathered in the drawing-room afterwards, their faces pale in the glow of gas lamps, sat an unobtrusive figure who spoke very little. He was small and round, with spectacles that seemed too large for his face, and a shabby umbrella that dripped steadily into the carpet. His clerical collar was almost hidden beneath a brown overcoat, shiny at the elbows. He looked rather like a parish clerk lost in a London railway station. This was Father Brown. He had been a guest of the local curate, and by accident, or providence, had been present that evening when the tragedy occurred. Most of those assembled scarcely noticed him. When they did, it was with faint embarrassment, as if unsure whether to treat him as a clergyman or as a piece of furniture. He himself seemed quite content with either. While the inspector questioned the household and Lady Miriam clutched her rosary in silence, Father Brown did nothing more remarkable than sip lukewarm tea. He gazed mildly at the rain sliding down the windows, as though it were the chief mystery of the night. Only once did he rise and wander into the corridor, where he stood looking thoughtfully at the library door, still hanging crookedly from its broken lock. Then, with a little nod to himself, he returned to his chair and resumed sipping his tea. The storm continued outside, a steady percussion on stone and slate, as if nature itself kept vigil with the dead. Within, the company settled into uneasy silence. The coroner's verdict seemed written already, yet every heart felt that some darker truth lingered in the air, like smoke after a fire. And in a quiet corner, the little priest sat like a forgotten child, his eyes twinkling faintly behind thick spectacles, as though he saw something others had missed, something as small and as fatal as a grain of ash upon a holy page. Chapter 2: A Gathering of Suspects. The morning after Sir Alister's death dawned bleak and colourless, as if the rain had drained the sky of every hue. Mist hung over the lawns of Grimswell Manor, smothering the trees and smudging the outline of the old tower. Within, the corridors echoed with footsteps, hushed voices, and the restless stirrings of a house that had ceased to be merely a home and become a stage for tragedy. By order of the inspector, the household and guests assembled in the drawing-room, a place of faded tapestries and high-backed chairs that looked designed more for endurance than comfort. There, each in turn was to account for his or her movements the night before. Lady Miriam entered first, her black gown already prepared, as though she had lived long expecting widowhood. She was tall, with a face more proud than pretty, though grief had softened it to something almost tender. Her rosary slipped continually through her fingers, bead by bead, as if her only anchor lay in prayer. She spoke little, and when she did, her voice was low but firm. "My husband was a difficult man," she said, "but not a coward. Do not think he fled from life. He would have fought his doubts to the end." Next came Edward Grimswell, Sir Alister's nephew. He was a young man of some 30 years, with the pale elegance of one who had tasted London society more than honest country air. His dark hair was brushed carefully, but his eyes shifted nervously. He laughed too loudly when questioned, and protested too much when the subject of inheritance was mentioned. "I loved my uncle, of course I did," he declared. "I had no quarrel with him. My debts, well, every gentleman has debts. That proves nothing." And yet, in the way he said it, one heard that it proved everything. Miss Rowena came after him, a slender figure with earnest eyes and a Bible clasped to her breast. She had been governess in the house for 2 years, though her charge, the young daughter of a cousin, was long since sent away to school. Her loyalty kept her at Grimswell. She spoke with nervous passion, her words tumbling out like a sermon from a chapel pulpit. Sir Alister denied the truth of heaven, but God forgive me, I prayed for him nightly. And when I heard the shot, I knew, it was not despair but something darker. Her eyes brimmed, and she added almost in a whisper, I loved him, though he never knew. Perhaps my love was a curse. The inspector scribbled impassively, while the rest shifted uncomfortably. Then Dr. Frobisher, the physician from the village, strode in with a briskness that barely concealed his unease. He was a tall man with a forehead as polished as his instruments and a manner as precise as his prescriptions. Suicide, of course, he pronounced, his voice clipped, as though he were delivering a diagnosis rather than an opinion. The man was weary of life. I warned him often that his nervous system was overtaxed. Melancholy, it's common among men of letters. No mystery here, gentlemen, only physiology. Yet his hands twitched slightly, and his eyes avoided the library door whenever he passed it. Finally came Mr. Carstone, the philosopher, a guest of Sir Alister's from Cambridge. He was a curious fellow, with a high brow and a habit of stroking his beard as though he were coaxing thoughts from it. He delighted in paradox, sprinkling his conversation with phrases that sparkled like glass beads but cut like knives. "You must not call it suicide," he said with relish, "but fulfillment. Man is the creature that ends himself." Sir Alister merely anticipated the conclusion that life itself inevitably dictates. "We all die," he chose to rehearse. He smiled as though this were a joke, but the smile made the room colder. The inspector cleared his throat and announced that until further notice, no one was to leave the house. That declaration hung in the air like a sentence of imprisonment, for though the drawing-room was grand, it felt suddenly like a cage. Each person, as though instinctively, glanced at the others, not with open suspicion, but with that furtive calculation by which one measures who might be foe, who friend, who threat. Through it all, Father Brown remained curiously inconspicuous. He had chosen a seat near the fireplace, where his round figure blended with the worn armchair like an additional cushion. He made no remarks, and seemed absorbed in polishing his spectacles with a large, handkerchief-like square of cloth that looked as though it had once been a napkin. If anyone noticed him, they assumed him harmless. Only once did he speak, and then to Lady Miriam. She had murmured again that her husband was not the sort to take his own life. Father Brown looked at her with gentle eyes and said, "Some men never believe in God, but believe very much in themselves. Such men sometimes fall hardest, for they cannot forgive their own failures." She looked startled, as though he had read something in her heart she had not confessed aloud. But before she could answer, he coughed apologetically and returned to his spectacles. Outside, the mist thickened. Inside, the air grew heavy with unspoken accusations. Each person in that somber gathering carried a secret, whether of love, pride, fear, or debt. Yet none suspected that the small priest in the corner, who seemed to see everything and say almost nothing, would soon read those secrets as easily as a curate reads the Psalter. For now, however, Father Brown remained what he appeared, an ordinary parish priest, ignored by the skeptical, underestimated by the clever, and regarded by the anxious as little more than background. And perhaps that was precisely why he saw more than all of them. Chapter 3: The Locked Room. The library of Grimswell Manor was one of those rooms that seemed designed to discourage frivolity. Its oak panelling absorbed the light, and its tall shelves frowned down like judges in wig and gown. Even in daylight it carried the gloom of perpetual dusk. At night, with a single lamp burning, it resembled a cavern with books for stalactites. It was here, behind the locked door, that Sir Alister's final scene was played. The inspector insisted that the company walk through the chamber once more, to steady our facts, as he put it. And so, like mourners at a visitation, they filed into the room where the master of the house had met his death. The body, of course, had been removed, but the memory of it remained as strong as a physical presence. The chair still sagged where his weight had fallen. The revolver, carefully placed in a sealed evidence bag, had left a faint mark on the carpet. The silence of the place was oppressive, as though even the dust dared not stir. The inspector gestured with his pencil. "Observe, the window is fastened inside with a catch. The chimney is narrow, untouched by soot. The bolt upon the door was driven from within. And here," he tapped the writing desk, "we have papers, disturbed in agitation, and this Bible, strangely open." The book indeed looked alien among the other volumes. Its gilt edges gleamed faintly in the lamplight, though dulled in one place by a smear of dark ash. The page, curiously enough, was from the Book of Job. The verse stared up like a challenge, "Let the day perish wherein I was born." Rowena shuddered and clasped her own Bible tighter. "It is a sign," she whispered. He was reading despair. Dr. Frobisher cleared his throat impatiently. He was a rationalist, madam, not a mystic. Perhaps he was quoting Job ironically. Men in despair often seek ironic comfort in sacred texts. Nothing unusual in it. Father Brown had wandered towards the shelves, running a stubby finger absent-mindedly along the spines of Greek philosophers. He spoke without turning. "I find it unusual," he said mildly, "that a man should open a book he disdained, and at precisely the right page to suit his mood. Despair is rarely so well arranged." Carstone chuckled, stroking his beard. "My dear father, men are always arranging their own despair. Suicide is but the art of perfect punctuation." The inspector, irritated by philosophy, returned to facts. He measured the window with his tape, tugged the bolt experimentally, examined the hearth for footprints. All was secure. "Plain as a pikestaff," he muttered. "The man locked himself in and shot himself. Nothing else fits." "Except," murmured Father Brown, still fingering the books, "the fact that life is rarely plain as a pikestaff. It is more like a walking stick, crooked, knobbly, and apt to trip you if you lean too hard." He smiled vaguely at his own remark, as if it were merely a homily about parish walking parties. Lady Miriam, who had said little since entering, now spoke in a low but steady voice. "My husband was many things, proud, skeptical, impatient, but he was not one to quit. He mocked my faith, yes, but he respected my courage in holding it. He would not have abandoned the fight. No, this," and she gestured towards the desk with trembling hand, "this was contrived." The inspector sighed, as though dealing with childish fancy. "And who, my lady, could contrive it?" "The room was locked. Unless one of you possesses the key to a miracle, I cannot see it." Edward, the nephew, laughed nervously. Perhaps it was a miracle of the devil's making. His eyes darted to the portraits glaring down from the walls, as though expecting ancestral figures to step down and accuse him. Rowena clutched her Bible closer. "The devil does not need bolts and windows. If Sir Alistair denied God, then the enemy had free entrance." At this, Carstone clapped his hands in mock applause. "Excellent theology. A locked room mystery solved by metaphysics. The inspector should be pleased, no paperwork required." The inspector glared. "I deal in facts, not fancies. The man killed himself, and that is the end." Yet in the silence that followed, everyone knew it was not the end. For the room itself seemed to whisper questions. Why were the books flung as though in haste? Why did a Bible, long neglected, lie open at a verse of despair? And why, above all, did Sir Alistair, so proud, so combative, meet death in a posture of weary defeat that belonged to another man entirely? Father Brown bent suddenly, peering at the hearth. He brushed the flagstones gently with his finger and brought it up to the light. A faint trace of grey clung there, not the thick soot of the chimney, but the fine dust of cigar ash. He said nothing, merely rubbed it absently between thumb and forefinger, as though considering the quality of flour in a baker's shop. "Father," said Lady Miriam, noticing him at last, "do you believe he killed himself?" Father Brown looked at her with eyes that seemed both kind and infinitely sad. "I believe," he said softly, "that men often kill themselves long before they fire a shot. They do it by killing their conscience, or their hope. But whether the pistol finished the deed, that I am not sure." The inspector snorted. "Well, I am sure. And certainty is what matters in law." "Perhaps," murmured Father Brown, "but not always in life." The company filed out slowly, each carrying away a different impression, Lady Miriam with her faith renewed in her husband's innocence, Edward with his guilt sharpened by suspicion, Rowena with her fear of unseen forces, Carstone with his smug satisfaction at having sowed confusion. Only Father Brown left the room with quiet certainty of a different kind, the certainty that some small, human flaw had betrayed the truth, and that he had just brushed against it like ash upon a holy page. Chapter 4: The Strange Confessions. The days that followed Sir Alistair's death were like a heavy fog, thick, muffling, and difficult to breathe in. Grimswell Manor, once a house of routine dinners, scholarly mutterings, and servants' gossip, had become a prison of suspicion. The inspector lingered in the village, returning each morning to prod at facts that never seemed to yield. The inquest loomed ahead, and with it, the question of whether the coroner's suicide would be recorded without challenge. Yet the people within the house had already begun to challenge it, each in their own way. It was as if the silence of the locked room had broken loose into the corridors, forcing words out of lips that would have preferred to stay sealed. Lady Miriam spoke least of all. She kept to her chamber or to the chapel in the village, slipping out in the mist with her rosary hidden in her sleeve. When spoken to, she answered gently, but with an air of withdrawal, like a soul already half in another world. Some said she prayed for her husband, others whispered she prayed for strength to forgive his murderer, if murderer there was. Edward, on the other hand, could not keep silence if he tried. He rattled about the drawing room, chain-smoking, spilling stories of London, laughing too loudly at his own wit. He was overheard arguing with the inspector, demanding that his uncles will be read immediately, though propriety forbade it before burial. His nerves betrayed him, he spilled ash on carpets, dropped glasses, and flashed whenever anyone so much as mentioned debts. Miss Rowena, the governess, wore her heart on her sleeve. One evening, when the others had retired, she lingered by the fire with Father Brown, her Bible clasped tight as though it alone could shield her from suspicion. "I must tell someone," she said suddenly, her voice trembling. "I cannot bear the weight of it." Father Brown looked up mildly, spectacles glinting in the firelight. "Then perhaps you should tell God," he said. She hesitated, then blurted, "I loved him. I loved Sir Alistair. I know it was sinful to harbour such thoughts, I a mere servant, he a married man, but I could not help myself. I prayed, I wrestled, but still my heart clung to him. And now he is dead. Was it my love that cursed him? Did I invite judgment upon this house?" Her tears fell hot and fast, and she buried her face in her hands. Father Brown said nothing for a long moment. Then he spoke, very gently. "My dear, love does not curse, pride does. Even misplaced affection, however foolish, is not enough to summon a bullet through a locked door. If your love had power to kill, the world would be emptier than it is. No, the curse here is something quite different. Do not mistake temptation for crime." Rowena looked at him as though he had lifted a stone from her chest. "Then you believe it was not suicide?" Father Brown stirred his tea absently. "I believe despair is a sin, but I do not believe Sir Alistair committed that particular one. His sins were others, and they may have brought him near death, but not by his own hand." The following morning, the inspector pressed Dr. Frobisher for further comment. The physician was growing testy under the constant questioning, and his answers were curt. "Suicide, suicide, suicide," he snapped. "You may pick the bones of circumstance all you like, but I tell you as a man of science, the symptoms are plain. Insomnia, restlessness, talk of futility, all the signs. A philosopher's mind can turn upon itself, like a serpent eating its tail. The pistol was the natural conclusion. And yet, Father Brown interjected quietly from the corner, a serpent that eats its own tail usually leaves the rest of the world alone. Sir Alistair's books, however, were scattered, as though there had been some interruption. Frobisher flushed and waved a hand. Perhaps a fit of passion, a man throwing down volumes in disgust. Perhaps, said Father Brown. He did not press the point. Mr. Carstone, meanwhile, relished the gloom. He drifted about the house like a crow, murmuring to anyone who would listen. "Death is but the footnote of existence," he declared. "Sir Alistair's passing only proves his consistency. He doubted all things, including himself. What more fitting end for a skeptic than self-destruction? He has made of his life a perfect philosophy, beginning in doubt, ending in silence. Edward snarled at him. You talk like a gal, Carstone. Philosophy won't pay my tailor, nor bury my uncle decently. Carstone merely smiled. Philosophy has buried many men decently. And a few indecently. Through all this, Father Brown remained outwardly untroubled. He asked small questions of servants, who dusted the desk last, who polished the candlesticks, who tidied the ashtrays. He inquired after trivialities, such as whether Sir Alistair had preferred cigars or pipes, and whether the fire in the library had been lit that evening. To the servants, it seemed the idle curiosity of a harmless priest. To the inspector, it seemed distraction. But to Father Brown himself, every answer was a piece of a human puzzle, not of bolts or windows, but of tempers and temptations. He was not chasing ghosts or miracles. He was tracing the little smudges of sin that men leave behind when they think their hands are clean. By the end of the week, the house was full of whispers, and every soul carried a burden of suspicion heavier than grief. But in the quiet of his room, Father Brown whispered only one line of prayer, "Deliver us from evil." And he wondered which of the inhabitants of Grimswell Manor had failed to say the same. Chapter 5 of A False Trail. The inspector, grown weary of speculation, decided that the case must be pushed towards conclusion. We can debate theology until kingdom come, he declared, but the law requires facts. And the facts point here. His pencil tapped firmly on the name of Edward Grimswell. Edward paled and laughed at once, a brittle, desperate laugh. Me? You cannot be serious. My uncle's death is a tragedy, but to accuse me, well, it's absurd. I've neither the courage nor the cruelty for such a thing. Nor the money, the inspector remarked dryly. And debt is the oldest motive of all. The accusation rang through the drawing room like the strike of a bell. The servants exchanged glances. Lady Miriam stiffened, though she said nothing. Rowena shrank back, clasping her Bible to her chest. Consider, the inspector went on, with the tone of a barrister, you quarrelled with your uncle last week, half the village heard it. You needed his signature to release funds. You were seen wandering the gardens that very evening, your boots wet with the same rain that fell when the pistol fired. What clearer picture does one need? Edward faltered, his hands trembling. I admit I argued with him. I admit I was angry. But anger is not murder. And as for money, yes, I need it. But I wouldn't kill for it. Surely you see. No, the inspector cut in. I see a young man cornered by circumstance, desperate enough to arrange what looked like suicide. A bolt can be set by clever hands, a window fastened after the fact. You may have believed yourself ingenious. Edward's voice cracked. You cannot prove that. The inspector smiled thinly. Perhaps not yet. But I mean to. Carstone, the philosopher, leaned back with relish. How delicious. Nephew kills uncle for lucre. A tale as old as Cain, yet still refreshing. Shut your mouth, Edward spat. Father Brown, who had been quietly studying the pattern of the carpet, now looked up. The trouble with false trails, he said softly, is that they are often too straight. Life seldom arranges itself with such tidiness. The inspector frowned. Do you doubt the evidence, Father? Brown shook his head. I doubt the interpretation. Edward is weak, careless, and foolish enough to borrow more than he can pay. But murder requires not only motive and opportunity, it requires a kind of dreadful courage. And that, I think, he has not. The inspector dismissed the remark with a shrug. But later that evening, Edward sought Father Brown out in the small chapel at the edge of the estate, where the priest had gone to say vespers. The young man's bravado had melted away, leaving only fear. They'll hang me for it, Edward muttered. I didn't kill him, but they'll say I did. You must believe me, Father. You're the only one who does. Father Brown lit a candle at the altar and regarded him kindly. I believe you are guilty of many things, my son, of pride, extravagance, dishonesty. But not of murder. The devil tempts men to many sins, but he knows which doors are locked. He does not waste time knocking where the bolt is fast. Edward gripped the pew, tears springing unbidden. Then who did? Who in this cursed house? Perhaps, said Father Brown gently, the question is not who, but why. Murderers rarely kill for the reason the world supposes. It is not always money or hatred. Sometimes it is vanity, or fear, or even love twisted out of shape. Remember that. When Edward left, steadier though still fearful, Father Brown remained in prayer. His round face, usually mild, was grave in the candlelight. He was thinking of ashes on a Bible, and a doctor who spoke too quickly of suicide. The following morning, another twist deepened the false trail. The inspector produced a half-burnt letter found in the library grate. Though much was illegible, the remaining words hinted at threat: if you do not comply, consequences. I will expose. The inspector waved the fragment triumphantly. Blackmail, you see. Edward, no doubt. Who else stood to gain by intimidating Sir Alistair? He must have resisted, and then the quarrel turned fatal. The household buzzed with excitement. Even Lady Miriam looked at Edward with pained uncertainty. Rowena wept openly, torn between compassion and suspicion. Edward himself sat slumped in his chair, pale as parchment. Father Brown examined the fragment briefly. Interesting, he said, almost absent-mindedly. But you see, this paper is not torn, it is cut, quite carefully. And the ink is fresh. Odd, is it not, that a letter threatening exposure should be so neatly prepared for the fire? The inspector snapped, you mean to say? I mean only, said Father Brown, that men do not blackmail in calligraphy. This looks more like a forgery, an attempt to create suspicion than to confess it. And suspicion, when aimed so directly, is usually aimed at the wrong man. The inspector threw up his hands in exasperation. You priests are full of riddles. Father Brown smiled faintly. And inspectors, full of answers. The truth, however, usually lies somewhere in between. So the net of suspicion remained tangled. Edward, though frightened, was no longer certain to be condemned. The inspector, though convinced, had nothing solid. And the rest of the household began to whisper of other possibilities, darker, subtler motives that might explain the unexplainable. In that uneasy atmosphere, Father Brown walked quietly in the gardens, his umbrella tucked under one arm. He listened not to the inspector's declarations or Edward's protests, but to the silence between them. And he prayed that when the true trail revealed itself, it would not lead to a soul beyond forgiveness. Chapter 6: The Spiritual Battle. The mist lingered around Grimswell Manor as if reluctant to leave, wrapping the turrets in a muffled shroud. Inside, the household had grown restless. The inspector was still circling his suspects, Lady Miriam prayed more fervently, Edward brooded in corners, and Rowena drifted about like a pale ghost of her own conscience. But Father Brown, unnoticed as ever, lingered most often in the library, where the atmosphere seemed heavy with something unspoken. It was late on the third evening when he found himself alone there. A single lamp burned on the desk, throwing yellow light across the scattered volumes. The Bible still lay open where it had been left, its pages fluttering faintly in the draught. Father Brown's eye settled once more on the smear of ash across the gilded edge. He touched it gently with his finger, rubbed it, and then smelt it. Ash, he murmured, but not from wood. From tobacco. The hearth was empty, swept clean, yet he had noticed traces of cigar ash before, brushed clumsily onto the flagstones. Sir Alistair had never smoked, he had despised the habit, mocking it as a priest's crutch for dull evenings. Yet someone had smoked here, recently, and without much caution. He looked about the room with his mild, near-sighted gaze. The pistol had lain close to the chair, too close to be accidental. The books had been cast down, but not as a man throws them in despair, rather as if one had knocked them in haste. The bolt on the door had been shattered open from without, but a man inside might easily have driven it shut to stage an illusion. It was all too neat. And behind neatness, Father Brown had often found pride. The door creaked, and he turned to see Dr. Frobisher entering, his coat half-buttoned, his expression sharp with irritation. "I thought I might find you here," the doctor said. "You clergy have a morbid fascination with death." Father Brown blinked at him. "Not with death, doctor. With the soul that lingers before it. And the sins that hurry it on." Frobisher gave a short laugh. "You will preach to me of sins, I suppose. Melancholy, despair, pride. I assure you, Sir Alistair's case was perfectly clinical. I warned him of nervous exhaustion. The end was inevitable." "Was it?" Father Brown asked softly. "I wonder. For if it were inevitable, why was the Bible touched at all? Sir Alistair mocked such things. He would not have reached for it in despair. But someone else might have, someone who disliked it enough to handle it carelessly, leaving ash upon its page." The doctor's face tightened. "You priests see miracles in dust. Ashes are nothing." "Indeed," said Father Brown, "ashes are nothing. Yet they are what remains of something. And every nothing tells a story." He paused, then added in a tone almost apologetic, "You smoked a Havana that night, did you not? They leave this sort of grey trace. But your hand was unsteady. A guilty hand often is." Frobisher's jaw hardened. "You accuse me of murder? Absurd. I had no motive. Sir Alistair was a patient. I had treated him for months." "Patience," said Father Brown gently, "can wound a doctor's pride more than any rival. Sir Alistair laughed at your science, dismissed your warnings, boasted of his own strength. Perhaps in anger you picked up the pistol to frighten him. But pride has a quicker finger than caution. When the shot rang out, you had only moments to turn a quarrel into suicide. You bolted the door, scattered the books, placed the weapon by his side. All clever enough, except for the ash. For pride forgets small things." The silence grew thick between them. The lamp hummed faintly. At last, Frobisher sank into the chair, covering his face with his hands. "You cannot know that," he whispered. "You cannot." "I do not know," said Father Brown quietly. "I only understand. I understand how temptation works. Anger breeds pride, pride breeds folly, and folly breeds blood. I have seen it before, in confessions whispered through a grill. I know the sound of a soul that has talked itself into sin." The doctor looked up, his eyes hollow. "It was an accident. I never meant." "I believe you," Father Brown said. "But accident does not erase guilt. Only repentance can do that." Frobisher shook his head, half in despair, half in defiance. "They will destroy me. My career, my reputation, everything will be gone." "Perhaps," the priest answered. "But there are worse things than being destroyed. There is the slow destruction of a man who hides from truth until he no longer knows himself at all." The doctor groaned and pressed his forehead against the desk. Father Brown laid a hand on his shoulder, almost paternal in its weight. "Do not mistake me, doctor. The law will have its say. But remember that mercy is older than law. I will help you to speak, not to hide. Better the shame of confession than the slow poison of deceit." For a long time, the only sound was the faint crackle of the lamp. Then Frobisher muttered, "Perhaps you are right. God help me." "God already does," Father Brown said simply. "That is why you are speaking to me now." The door opened suddenly, footsteps echoed in the corridor. The inspector's voice barked a question. Frobisher flinched, but Father Brown's grip tightened gently. "Courage," the priest murmured. "The battle of the spirit is not fought in courtrooms, but in hearts. And you have begun to fight it." Outside, the mist pressed against the windows, thick and relentless. Inside, two men sat in silence, one bowed under the weight of guilt, the other steady in the quiet strength of compassion. And somewhere, in that hush, the true struggle of Grimswell Manor had begun, not of bolts and pistols, but of pride against repentance, and darkness against the small but stubborn light of grace. Chapter 7, The Unmasking. The following evening, the drawing-room of Grimswell Manor was lit with a somber glow. Heavy curtains shut out the mist, and the fire snapped weakly in the grate, as though even the flames felt the chill of suspicion. The inspector had called the household together once more. He was determined, he said, to bring the matter to a conclusion. Edward paced like a caged fox, muttering about injustice. Lady Miriam sat upright in her chair, rosary hidden in her hands. Rowena hovered on the edge of the circle, pale and taut as a wire. Carstone leaned against the mantelpiece, his beard twitching with amused anticipation. And Father Brown, small and round, sat near the hearth, looking for all the world like a sleepy uncle at a family gathering. The inspector cleared his throat. "You all know why we are here. Sir Alistair's death, suicide, in my opinion, has been clouded with rumours. To end them, I must settle on the likeliest account. Edward Grimswell." But before he could continue, Father Brown coughed gently. It was not a dramatic interruption, merely a polite clearing of the throat, but it stopped the room as effectively as a pistol shot. "Forgive me," said the priest, "but before you proceed, may I tell a little story? It is very short, and it may help." The inspector frowned, but curiosity stilled him. Carstone smirked. Edward groaned. Lady Miriam looked up, startled. Father Brown folded his hands. Once, there was a man who prided himself on his knowledge. He had read every book on illness and cure. He thought himself wiser than his patients, wiser even than God. One day, his pride was insulted by a man who laughed at him. In a flash of anger, he snatched a weapon, not meaning to kill, but to frighten. Yet pride, once unchained, is like a runaway horse. The weapon fired. The man fell dead. Now the proud man had another choice, to confess his folly or to hide it. He chose to hide it. He arranged the scene, scattered books, bolted doors. He thought himself very clever. But he forgot one thing, that pride never notices small things. And so, while covering up a great crime, he left behind a little trace, ash on a holy page. A hush spread across the room. Frobisher, who had entered late, froze where he stood. The colour drained from his face. The inspector blinked. "Father, what are you implying?" "I am not implying," Father Brown said gently. "I am explaining. Sir Alistair did not kill himself. Dr. Frobisher killed him in anger, then tried to disguise it. The cigar ash betrayed him. He alone smoked in that room. He alone insisted too fiercely upon suicide. He alone feared theology, preferring physiology. Pride was his undoing." The silence broke like glass. Edward gasped in relief, Rowena let out a sob, Lady Miriam pressed her rosary to her lips. Carstone gave a little chuckle, as though applauding a clever performance. Frobisher staggered forward, his voice hoarse. "Lies! All lies? You cannot prove." But his protest faltered under the weight of his own trembling. The inspector stepped towards him, hard-eyed. "Is this true, Doctor?" Frobisher's hands twitched, then dropped to his sides. He seemed suddenly very small, his precision and arrogance collapsed like a broken instrument. "It was an accident," he muttered. "I never meant, I only wished to silence his taunts. He mocked me, mocked my science. I thought to frighten him. And then it was done. I panicked. God help me, I staged it as suicide." Rowena covered her face. Lady Miriam bowed her head, her lips moving silently in prayer. Edward gave a shaky laugh, half relief, half hysteria. Carstone clapped his hands once, as though delighted at the spectacle. The inspector seized Frobisher by the arm. "You will answer to the law." But Father Brown rose quietly and touched the inspector's sleeve. "Answer to the law, yes. But let him answer also to mercy. This was pride, not malice. The man killed more out of weakness than strength. Punishment will come, let us not forget forgiveness." Frobisher sank into a chair, covering his face again. He did not resist as the inspector called for his men. The tension in the room eased, though uneasily. Edward collapsed into a chair, laughing and weeping by turns. Rowena knelt by the fire, murmuring prayers. Lady Miriam looked across at Father Brown, her eyes filled with sorrow and gratitude. Carstone alone seemed unsatisfied, stroking his beard as if the unmasking had robbed him of some private amusement. Father Brown settled back into his chair, looking faintly apologetic for having disturbed the proceedings. He spoke softly, almost to himself. It is curious. We think of devils as storming gates and breaking locks. But most of the time they slip in quietly, through the small crack of vanity or wounded pride. And once inside, they need no miracle to kill a man. The inspector, shaken but practical, gave orders for Frobisher's removal. The household dispersed, some in shock, some in relief. Only Father Brown lingered by the fire, gazing at the ashes. He seemed to be looking not at what was left of the wood, but at what had burned away unseen. Chapter 8, A Quiet Resolution. The morning after the unmasking, Grimswell Manor was strangely still. The mist had lifted at last, leaving the lawns wet with dew, the hedges sparkling in pale sunlight. Yet inside, the silence was heavier than any fog. Death, confession, and shame had settled upon the house like a pall. Dr. Frobisher had been taken under guard to the county town. His protests of accident had not saved him, though Father Brown's quiet intercession had ensured he was treated with dignity. The law would judge him, but his own conscience had already begun its harsher trial. In the drawing room, the family and guests gathered one last time, uncertain whether they were mourning Sir Alistair or themselves. Lady Miriam sat near the window, her rosary wound tight around her wrist. Edward lounged uneasily, relief at his reprieve soured by the knowledge of how close he had come to ruin. Rowena lingered near the fire, pale but calmer than she had been in days. Carstone looked irritated, as though robbed of a philosophical diversion that had ended too prosaically. The inspector, brusque as ever, reviewed his notes. The matter will now proceed to court. Suicide is ruled out. Murder, manslaughter, if you will, stands. Justice will take its course. He closed his notebook with finality, as though the very sound of its clasp ended the affair. But Father Brown, seated unobtrusively in his usual corner, shook his head gently. Justice will take its course, yes. But justice is not the whole story. If it were, none of us would be here. The inspector frowned. What do you mean, Father? The facts are plain. He killed. He will be punished. End of matter. Father Brown leaned forward slightly, spectacles glinting. I mean that facts alone are seldom the end. Sir Alistair died not only because of a pistol, but because of pride, his own and another's. The quarrel was born of vanity, one man mocking faith, another boasting of science. The shot was the fruit of anger, but the seed was planted long before. Lady Miriam looked up sharply. Then you do not condemn the doctor utterly. Father Brown's eye softened. Condemnation is God's business. I only point out that he sinned as men commonly do, not out of monstrous cruelty, but out of a wounded sense of self. He sought to be respected more than he sought to be good. That is a very ordinary temptation, though it led here to a very terrible result. Rowena whispered, then we are all guilty. In a way, Father Brown replied. For sin is seldom solitary. Each of us contributes in small ways, by mockery, by neglect, by silence. Even by loving too much or too little. That is why forgiveness matters as much as judgment. The inspector muttered something about priests and their sermons, but his tone was less sharp than usual. Edward spoke suddenly, almost defiantly. You talk of forgiveness. But what of me? They nearly hanged me for it. Am I to forgive so easily? Father Brown regarded him kindly. Perhaps you should begin by forgiving yourself, Edward. Not for murder, for you did not commit it, but for greed, for recklessness, for the fear that made you a liar even in your own mind. A man who cannot forgive himself will always believe others eager to condemn him. Edward flushed, then looked away. Lady Miriam rose, her figure tall against the morning light. I will forgive, she said quietly. I must. My husband is gone, but bitterness will not bring him back. If prayer can reach beyond the grave, then prayer can reach a prison cell also. I will pray for them both. Rowena stepped forward timidly. And I, though I am foolish, I will pray too. Carstone gave a dry laugh. You all speak as though forgiveness were a currency you could spend. Philosophy teaches that men are ruled by fate, not mercy. Father Brown turned to him, his voice very soft. Fate did not fire the pistol, Mr. Carstone. A man did. And that same man can repent. That is the difference between philosophy and faith. One imprisons, the other frees. For once, Carstone had no reply. The inspector, seeing that no more testimony could be gained, gathered his papers. Well, I must be off. I dare say I shall never understand priests. But I suppose your kind can make sense of things the law cannot. He bowed stiffly to Lady Miriam and departed. The household dispersed gradually, each person carrying away a different burden, Lady Miriam with her resolve to forgive, Edward with the memory of his near ruin, Rowena with her chastened hope, and Carstone with his unanswered questions. At last, Father Brown walked alone in the garden. The air was fresh after days of mist, and the blackbird sang as though nothing had happened at all. He paused by a bench and leaned on his umbrella. It is easy, he murmured, to imagine devils in locked rooms, or curses in old houses. But the real mystery is always nearer, inside the heart. Pride is a better conjurer than any ghost, and despair is a darker jailer than any bolt. Yet grace, thank God, slips through locks as easily as light through a crack. He sighed, not in weariness but in quiet satisfaction, and set off down the path that led to the village. Behind him, Grimswell Manor stood solemn and silent once more, a house chastened by tragedy but touched, perhaps, by something gentler too. And so the little priest disappeared into the morning sunlight, leaving behind not triumph but peace, the peace of truth spoken softly, and mercy offered freely, in a world where both are often in short supply.